In the early morning hours of September 18th, guard Robert Payne was making his routine rounds of the women's block at Magnolia Bay Prison. The day promised to be the same as all the previous ones: cell checks, breakfast distribution, routine procedures, until he reached cell number 237, where Maria Ramirez was serving her sentence. "Wake up, Ramirez," the guard said, tapping his key on the bars. There was no response. The woman lay motionless on her bunk facing the wall. Robert sensed something wrong and unlocked the door and stepped inside. When he touched the prisoner's shoulder, he jerked his hand away. The body was cold and unnaturally hard. "Code blue in cell block C," he shouted into his walkie-talkie, activating prison protocol upon finding the dead prisoner. 20 minutes later, Maria Ramirez's cell became a crime scene. The prison doctor had pronounced death, tentatively determining that it had occurred around midnight. The 34-year-old inmate's body was found in bed, with no visible signs of struggle or violence. It might have looked like a natural death, were it not for strange bluish stains on her neck and the inside of her wrists. Warden Lorraine Wilson ordered the police and medical examiner to be called immediately. Her face was impenetrable, but her eyes betrayed concern. Detective Daniel Fisher arrived at Magnolia Bay at 9 o'clock in the morning, tall, with a military bearing and a penetrating gaze in his gray eyes. He was known for his methodical and persistent nature. He was met by the warden, a stern-looking woman in an austere suit whose graying hair was gathered into a tight bundle. "We've kept the scene intact, Detective," Wilson said, as she led him through the security system. Maria Ramirez was serving a 5-year sentence for fraud and forgery. Exemplary behavior, no incidents until today. Fisher nodded silently, making notes in his notebook. He was met in the cell by forensic scientist Tom Green, who was already completing the initial examination of the body. "What do we got, Tom?" Fisher asked, putting on his gloves. "Looks like strangulation at first glance, probably with a pillow or a soft object," Green replied. "What's odd is that there's no sign of struggle, not under her fingernails, not on her body. It's like she didn't fight back or she was unconscious." Fisher took a close look around the cell. A small space 3 by 2 meters, a bunk, a metal table bolted to the floor, a toilet, and a sink. On the table were several books, photographs, letters, all neatly laid out. "Something's wrong," he muttered, examining the contents of the drawer under the bunk. "It's too clean, like someone had cleaned up before they died." A strange detail caught his attention, a wet spot on the sheet near where the victim's head had been lying. "Tom, check it out," he pointed to the expert. Green treated the stain with a special solution, which turned a characteristic color. "Saliva," he confirmed. "Could be vomit or frothing at the mouth. We need to run toxicology." Fisher noticed another oddity: thin scratches on the floor by the bed, as if something heavy had been moved. An hour later, Maria Ramirez's body was sent to the morgue for autopsy, and Fisher began interviewing staff. The first was the guard who had discovered the body. "She was a quiet prisoner," Robert Payne said, tapping his fingers nervously on his desk. "She kept to herself, but she didn't cause any trouble. Lately, she seemed to be cheerful." "Cheerful?" Fisher asked. "What do you mean?" "Well, smiling more, singing sometimes. I'd never noticed that before." Next was the night guard who had been on duty in cell block C the night before, James Montgomery, a middle-aged man with an unremarkable appearance and calm eyes. "Did you notice anything unusual?" Fisher asked, watching the guard's reaction carefully. Montgomery tensed slightly, but his voice remained steady. It was business as usual. "Check at 22 o'clock. Prisoner Ramirez was in her cell reading a book. 23 o'clock, lights out, all quiet." "And you didn't check her again?" "We do rounds every 2 hours. 1 o'clock in the morning, I walked by. Cell was dark, quiet." Something in his answers alarmed Fisher, but he couldn't pinpoint what it was. The detective decided to postpone further questioning of Montgomery until the autopsy results were in. Toward evening, Tom Green called. "I have some interesting news, Daniel. Cause of death was strangulation, as I suspected. But there's something else. The woman was pregnant, about 12 weeks. Fisher whistled. "Interesting twist. Did anyone at the prison know about this?" "Apparently not. There was nothing in the medical records about it. Either she was hiding it or..." Or somebody cleaned up the records. Fisher finished for him. The next day, the detective returned to the prison to talk to Angela Perez, the victim's cellmate. A thin woman with sharp features and a wary gaze, she was reluctant to answer questions until Fisher mentioned the pregnancy. "Did she tell you?" Angela suddenly asked, leaning forward. "No, that's what the autopsy showed," Fisher replied, watching the woman's reaction carefully. "Did you know?" Angela looked around, as if to see if anyone was listening. "Maria told me a month ago. She was afraid, but she was happy." "Do you know who the father is?" The woman lowered her eyes. "That's dangerous information, Detective." "I can protect you," Fisher insisted. "But I need to know the truth." After a long silence, Angela whispered, "One of the guards. I don't know exactly who. She never named names. But they used to meet in the laundry room at night. Maria said he promised to help her with her parole." "When was the last time they saw each other?" "The night before she died. Maria came back very agitated, said she had hope for a new life." This information caused Fisher to rethink the whole investigation. He requested the surveillance tapes, but was denied by the prison administration. The system had been under maintenance for the last 3 days. "Strange coincidence, don't you think?" Fisher remarked, sitting in the warden's office. Lorraine Wilson kept a nonchalant expression on her face. "We do routine maintenance every quarter, Detective. Nothing suspicious." "Then perhaps you can explain to me how an inmate got pregnant in your facility. Or is that part of routine maintenance too?" Wilson's face trembled slightly, but she quickly pulled herself together. "I'm not prepared to discuss unverified rumors. If you have specific allegations, channel them through the DA. They're not rumors, they're autopsy results," Fisher countered. "And I want to know which of your employees had access to C Block on the night of September 17th. I'll give you a list of those on duty." Wilson reluctantly agreed. "But I insist that you proceed with caution. The reputation of our institution will suffer as it is from this incident." After receiving the list, Fisher noticed that James Montgomery was indeed on duty that night in C Block. But besides him, there were 2 other guards there and a nurse making rounds with medication. The detective decided to talk to Montgomery again, but learned that he had taken time off for a family emergency. A call to the guard's home address went unanswered. Fisher sensed that there was much more lurking behind the walls of Magnolia Bay than met the eye. Maria Ramirez's death was becoming more and more mysterious, and the general silence and resistance of the staff only increased his suspicions. "I'm not leaving here until I find out the truth," he promised Angela Perez before he left. "For Maria and her unborn child." "Be careful, Detective," the woman replied. "Everything within these walls has eyes and ears." As he left the prison, Fisher caught the attentive gaze of one of the guards. Their eyes met for a moment, and the guard quickly looked away. His intuition told the detective that he was on the right track, but also warned him of the danger that could await him in this investigation. Daniel Fisher sat in his office with the documents from Maria Ramirez's personnel file spread out in front of him. Photographs, police reports, court records, anything that could shed light on the life of the woman found dead in a jail cell. Maria Ramirez was born in San Antonio, Texas, to Mexican immigrant parents. Her father worked in construction, her mother as a motel maid. High school, college where she studied accounting but didn't graduate due to financial problems. Then a series of low-paying jobs, a marriage to one Jorge Ramirez that ended in divorce after 3 years. First arrest at age 28 for petty fraud, forged an employer's check, probation, then a move to New Orleans in search of a new life, a secretarial job at the law firm of Bennett and Associates. Fisher frowned, studying the circumstances of the last arrest. Maria was convicted of a series of frauds with the documents of the firm's clients. She created fictitious accounts and transferred money to shell companies. The amount of damage, almost $150,000. Too complicated a scheme for a secretary without special education, Fisher muttered. His attention was drawn to the name of Maria's lawyer, Richard Bennett, the son of the owner of the very law firm where she worked. It was odd that the family affected by her actions had provided her with a defense. Moreover, thanks to Bennett Jr.'s efforts, Maria had only gotten 5 years instead of a possible 15. Fisher wrote down the name of the defense attorney, deciding to verify this information later. Perhaps Maria was not the perpetrator, but merely a convenient scapegoat. The next step was to check on James Montgomery. The detective called the prison's Human Resources Department and requested his personnel file. "Is Montgomery still missing?" Fisher asked a female employee. "Yeah, he took a week's leave of absence. Said he had a family emergency." "That's an odd coincidence, don't you think?" the detective remarked. Right after the death of an inmate in his cell block. After receiving Montgomery's file, Fisher learned that he'd been in the penal system for 12 years, the last 5 at Magnolia Bay. Divorced, no kids, lives in the suburbs of New Orleans, no service record, positive references. Fisher went to Montgomery's address. The one-story house in a quiet neighborhood looked tidy but deserted. The detective knocked on the door. No response. The neighbor, an elderly woman watering flowers in her yard, said she hadn't seen James in days. "He's usually so punctual, always saying hello," she said. "But since Monday, his car has been gone." Fisher left his business card, asking his neighbor to contact him if Montgomery showed up, and returned to the station. There, he got a surprise. A message from an officer that James Montgomery had come to the police station himself and was asking to see the detective in charge of the Maria Ramirez case. The guard sat in the interrogation room, tapping his fingers nervously on the desk. He looked exhausted, with eyes red from lack of sleep and 2 days' worth of stubble. "Thank you for coming in, Mr. Montgomery," Fisher began, turning on the tape. "You wanted to talk to me?" "I know you're looking for me," James replied. "And I understand what it looks like. My sudden disappearance after what happened to Maria. What does it look like?" "Like an admission of guilt," the guard sighed. "But I didn't kill her. I swear to you." "But you were more familiar with her than your position implies, right?" Fisher asked bluntly. Montgomery lowered his head, his shoulders slumped. "Yes, we had a relationship. I know I broke all the rules, jeopardized my career, but I really loved her." "And you knew about the pregnancy?" "Yes." His voice trembled. "Maria told me 2 weeks before she died. I was shocked, but happy. We planned for the future. I applied for a transfer to another prison so that when she was released, we could be together without complications." "Then why did you run away after she died?" "I was afraid," Montgomery exclaimed. "You see, I was the last person to see her alive. We met in the laundry room as usual. Maria was excited, saying she'd found some information that could shorten her sentence a lot. Something to do with her case and the people who framed her." Fisher stepped forward. "What kind of information?" "She didn't say specifically. She was afraid it was dangerous. Wanted to consult with her former lawyer, Bennett, first. They were scheduled to meet the next day." "Which didn't materialize," Fisher noted. "Yeah, I got off duty at 2 a.m., handed the shift over to Harry Peterson. Maria was alive and well the last time I saw her." "Why should I believe you?" "I have no motive to kill her," Montgomery exclaimed. "I loved Maria. We were expecting a child, planning for the future." Fisher stared into the guard's eyes for a long time, trying to determine if he was telling the truth. "I'll check your statement," the detective finally said. "For now, don't leave town." After the interrogation, Fisher decided to check Maria's financial situation. He requested her bank account statements and found a strange pattern. Every month, the account received a sum of $500 from a certain prisoner support fund. Upon closer inspection, it turned out that no such fund officially existed. Someone was sending her money regularly, disguising it as charity, the detective muttered, making notes. Even stranger was the fact that a week before Maria's death, a large sum of $10,000 had been deposited into her account, the source of which was also untraceable. Fisher returned to Magnolia Bay Prison to once again thoroughly search Maria's cell. This time he noticed a strange feature of the metal table. One of its legs was slightly shorter than the others. "Give me a screwdriver," he asked the officer accompanying him. Unscrewing the leg, Fisher found a folded notebook wrapped in polyethylene inside. Maria Ramirez's diary. Back at the station, the detective immersed himself in reading. The entries began with the first day in jail and described the daily routine. But about a year later, more disturbing entries emerged. "Saw Wilson talking to that man again today. Money handed over right in her office. No one notices, but I can see it. The packages come every Tuesday. A white van with a laundromat logo on it. But it's not laundry at all. James doesn't know anything. He's better off staying in the dark. He's a good man. I don't want him involved." The last entry was made the night before he died. I found proof. Documents from the accounting department, copies of transfer confirmations. Bennett was right. They're using me as a scapegoat. But now I have a chance to clear my name. Tomorrow, everything changes. For me, for our baby, for James. Fisher closed the journal, feeling the pieces of the puzzle begin to fit together. Maria had inadvertently witnessed a corruption scheme in the prison and may have found proof of her innocence in the original fraud case. The detective devoted the next few days to watching the prison. On Tuesday, he saw the same white van with the laundromat logo mentioned in the diary. The van arrived at 10 in the morning and left 30 minutes later. Fisher followed it to a warehouse on the outskirts of town owned by Southern Supply. A simple check revealed that the owner of the company was Marcus Bennett, the father of attorney Richard Bennett, who had defended Maria at the trial. Too many coincidences, Fisher muttered as he looked through the documents. He decided to meet Richard Bennett. The young lawyer received him in a luxurious office in downtown New Orleans. "Maria Ramirez?" Bennett interjected when he heard the detective's question. "Yes, I represented her. Sad story, smart woman, but she got involved with a bad company." "Did you keep in touch with her after the verdict?" Bennett was visibly tense. "Occasionally. Professional ethics, you know. I try to keep an eye on my clients. Even the ones who stole from your father? Especially those," the lawyer replied after a pause. "Sometimes people deserve a second chance. You had an appointment with her for the day she died. Why?" Bennett turned pale. "How did you... That's privileged information. Maria is dead, Mr. Bennett. Confidentiality is no longer as important as establishing the truth." The lawyer was silent for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "She said she'd found proof of her innocence, that she'd been framed. But she didn't show up for the meeting, so I assumed she'd changed her mind." "You didn't think it was odd that she didn't show up and give you a heads up?" "Things happen in prison, detective. I thought she wasn't allowed out for the meeting. It happens." Fisher wasn't convinced of the lawyer's sincerity, but he decided not to push it yet. "One more question. What do you know about Southern Supply?" Bennett's face froze. "It's my father's business. Why do you ask?" "Just curiosity," Fisher replied. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Bennett." As he left the office, the detective was sure the lawyer was hiding something. Perhaps Maria herself was part of some big scheme and then decided to get out. Fisher's next step was to check out the connection between the laundromat van, Southern Supply, and Magnolia Bay Prison. He requested a search warrant for the company's warehouse, but encountered unexpected resistance. The request was denied by Judge Harrison, known for his ties to influential New Orleans families. Lacking official authorization, Fisher decided to act differently. He turned to his informant in the narcotics department. "Check this address on your radar," Fisher asked, relaying the warehouse information, but quietly, without making too much noise. A day later, the informant called back. "You've hit a hornet's nest, Daniel. That warehouse is under surveillance, but not by our department, by the feds. They're investigating a major money laundering and drug trafficking scheme, and your Magnolia Bay prison is one of the links in that chain." "The feds?" Fisher wondered. "Why aren't they coordinating with the local police?" "Because they suspect some high-ranking New Orleans police officers are involved in the scheme. Be careful, friend. You're digging too deep." It explained why the case of Maria's death was going so badly. If she had indeed uncovered evidence of corruption involving high ranks, her life was in jeopardy. Fisher returned to Maria's diary, rereading its entries looking for indications of specific names or places. One entry caught his attention. "Saw a new shipment today. Boxes labeled medical supplies. They are taken to Office D in the administration wing. There they are received by a man in a suit everyone calls the judge." The detective remembered that Judge Harrison, who had denied his search request, often attended charity events for Magnolia Bay inmates. The puzzle was slowly coming together. The prison was being used as a transshipment point for drugs disguised as medicine. Lorraine Wilson, the warden, was in on the deal. Southern Supply, owned by Marcus Bennett, provided the transportation, and Judge Harrison provided the legal cover. But how does Maria Ramirez fit into this scheme? Maybe her fraud with Bennett's company records was part of a larger money laundering scheme. And when Maria ended up in jail and accidentally found out about the ongoing operation, she became a dangerous witness. Fisher decided to share his suspicions with the New Orleans police captain, but was careful in his wording, remembering the informant's warning. "I have reason to believe that Maria Ramirez's death is related to drug smuggling through Magnolia Bay Prison," Fisher informed his superior. "A serious accusation, Detective," the captain frowned. "Do you have concrete evidence?" "The diary of the deceased, the testimony of Montgomery's guard, the strange financial transactions in Ramirez's account, and a match to the Fed's investigation." "The Feds?" The captain was visibly tense. "Have you had any contact with the FBI?" "No, but I have information that they're conducting a parallel investigation," Fisher replied evasively. "Okay, keep working, but be careful. I don't want us to interfere with a federal investigation, if there really is one." Leaving the captain's office, Fisher could not escape the feeling that his superior was not telling him the truth. Perhaps the informant's warning had been correct, and the corruption ran deeper than he had realized. Back at home, the detective spread all the available evidence and notes on the table, trying to see the big picture. Maria's death, her pregnancy, the relationship with the guard, the corruption in the prison, the drug trafficking, it was all connected. But how exactly? Fisher's gaze stopped on a photograph of Maria taken at the time of her first arrest, a young woman with intelligent eyes and a determined look. She didn't look like a common con artist, more like someone in the wrong place at the wrong time. "I'll find the truth, Maria," Fisher promised, looking at the photograph. "Whatever it takes." The morning greeted Daniel Fisher with a call from the lab. The toxicology expert had unexpected news. Maria Ramirez's blood had traces of a sleeping pill that was not on the list of medications given to her. "A sufficient dose to put a person into a deep sleep," the expert explained. "That explains the lack of signs of struggle. She was physically unable to resist." "Who had access to the medication in the prison?" Fisher asked. "According to protocol, only the medical staff and the warden. The guards do not have direct access to the drugs." This information narrowed down the suspects and pointed to a carefully planned murder rather than an impulsive act. Fisher decided to check the night shift again on the day of the murder. In addition to James Montgomery, the nurse on duty was Sandra Collins. Wasting no time, the detective went to the jail to talk to the nurse. Sandra turned out to be a nervous, middle-aged woman who immediately tensed up when she saw Fisher. "I've testified before," she said, avoiding a direct look. "There was nothing unusual that night." "Did you give sleeping pills to Maria Ramirez?" Fisher asked bluntly. Sandra turned visibly pale. "No, she didn't have a prescription for sedatives." "That's odd because toxicology showed a high concentration of zolpidem in her blood. How do you explain that?" The nurse fidgeted nervously with the hem of her uniform. "Yeah, I don't know. Maybe she got it unofficially. Some inmates exchange medications. Or someone on staff gave it to her without a note in her medical records." There was a struggle on Sandra's face. "Look, Detective, I'm just doing my job. I don't want any trouble." "There's already trouble," Fisher pointed out. "The woman's dead. If you know something and you're hiding it, that makes you an accessory to murder." After a long silence, Sandra said quietly, "That night, Miss Wilson called me into her office. She said Ramirez needed a sedative because she was agitated and might hurt herself. I gave her the standard dosage and wrote it in the dispensing log." "But not in the patient's medical records?" "Miss Wilson said she would make the entry herself." Sandra swallowed nervously. The next day, the log was gone. When I asked about it, I was told that there had been a mistake and that the old log had been destroyed according to protocol. This conversation confirmed Fisher's suspicions. The warden was involved in Maria Ramirez's death. But was she a direct perpetrator, or only an accomplice? The detective decided to check another clue, the last mention in Maria's diary of documents proving her innocence. If she had indeed found such evidence, it must be hidden somewhere. Fisher returned to the dead woman's cell and methodically, centimeter by centimeter, examined the entire space. A small crack in the wall near the ventilation grate caught his attention. When he looked closely, he saw signs of recent tampering. Someone had peeled away the mortar between the bricks. "I need a flashlight and a thin tool," he asked the guard accompanying him. With a long pair of tweezers, Fisher extracted a plastic bag of documents rolled up in a tube from the crevice. They were copies of wire transfers, receipts, and memos, all indicating that substantial sums of money had passed through Southern Supply, which were then distributed to accounts associated with the prison administration. One of the documents particularly interested Fisher. It was a copy of an order transferring $100,000 to an account at a bank in the Cayman Islands. The signature on the document belonged to Lorraine Wilson. Armed with the new evidence, Fisher went to the warden's office. Lorraine Wilson greeted him with cold courtesy. "What can I do for you, detective? Are you making any progress in your investigation?" "More than that," Fisher replied, laying out the documents he'd found in front of her. "Would you like to explain these financial transactions, Miss Wilson?" The woman's face petrified, but she quickly pulled herself together. "These are confidential prison records. Where did you get them?" "They were hidden in Maria Ramirez's cell. The same inmate who died after you personally ordered her to be sedated without a note in her medical records." "These are serious allegations, detective." Wilson's voice remained steady, but there was a twinkle of fear in his eyes. "Do you have evidence other than the word of a nervous nurse and some paperwork that may have been forged? There's Maria's diary where she details a scheme to smuggle drugs through your prison. There's James Montgomery's testimony that Maria was going to meet with an attorney to turn over evidence of her innocence. And there are toxicology results confirming the violent nature of the death." Wilson was silent, contemplating the situation. Finally, she sighed heavily. "You don't realize what you've gotten yourself into, detective? This is much bigger than the death of one inmate." "Then explain it to me." "Magnolia Bay is only a small part of the system," Wilson began. "Drug operations, money laundering, all controlled by people you'll never get to. Judges, prosecutors, politicians, lots of people involved. And you decided to join this lucrative business too?" "I didn't have a choice," Wilson retorted. "When I was appointed to this position 5 years ago, the system was already in place. They just explained the rules of the game to me." "And Maria just happened to know the rules," Fisher said. "And she was smart enough to gather evidence." "She shouldn't have poked her nose in," Wilson shook her head. "That stupid girl thought she could use the information to buy herself an early release. Didn't realize the forces she was playing with." "So you killed her?" Wilson looked at Fisher with surprise. "Me? No, detective. I did order her to be sedated because I was instructed to do so, but I didn't go into her cell that night." "Then who did?" The warden was silent, as if weighing whether to give out this information. "If you really want to know the truth," she said at last, "talk to Richard Bennett. He came to the prison the night before Maria died. He registered as her lawyer, but the meeting was not in the visiting room, but in my office." This information surprised Fisher. Bennett didn't mention the prison visit when they talked. "Why would he kill his former client?" "Because his father is the one running the whole operation," Wilson replied. "And because Maria knew too much about the Bennett family. She wasn't just a client of their firm. She'd been Richard's mistress at one time. He'd gotten her involved in a scheme to forge documents and then set her up when the case started to attract too much attention. Now everything was falling into place. Maria was indeed the scapegoat in a fraudulent scheme organized by the Bennett family. And getting pregnant by a prison guard was the last straw. Richard couldn't let his former mistress, who had dangerous information, go free. "Do you have evidence of Bennett's presence in the prison that night?" "CCTV," Wilson replied. "But the footage is stored on a secure server that only I and state security have access to." "I'll get a warrant for those tapes," Fisher said. "In the meantime, you remain in custody on suspicion of accessory to murder and corruption." Calling for backup, the detective formally arrested Lorraine Wilson. She didn't resist, realizing the game was over. With warrant in hand, Fisher gained access to the prison's surveillance footage, and indeed, the cameras recorded Richard Bennett's arrival at 7 o'clock the evening before Maria's death. He spent about an hour in the warden's office, and then, more importantly, a camera in the corridor of C Block captured his passage, accompanied by a guard at around 11 o'clock in the evening. The camera by Maria's cell was switched off for maintenance, but another at the end of the corridor showed Bennett leaving the block 20 minutes later. Armed with irrefutable evidence, Fisher obtained a warrant for Richard Bennett's arrest. The police seizure team arrived at the attorney's office early in the morning. Bennett was stunned to see a detective with a warrant. This is some kind of mistake, he muttered as he was handcuffed. The only mistake is that you underestimated Maria Ramirez, Fisher replied. She was smarter than you thought. At the police station, confronted with the videotapes and Wilson's testimony, Bennett finally broke down. You don't understand, he said. She threatened to destroy everything. Not just the business, but the family's reputation. She kept my letters where I admitted to fraud. When she got pregnant by that security guard, she figured she now had leveraged the baby and the evidence. She was ready to destroy everything I'd built. And so you gave her sleeping pills and then smothered her with a pillow, Fisher finished. Cold-blooded murder. I was protecting my family, Bennett repeated stubbornly. And yet you can't prove anything against my father. He has too many connections. But Fisher had already turned over all the evidence he'd collected to the federal agents who were actually conducting a parallel investigation. A massive drug trafficking and corruption operation began simultaneously in several states. Marcus Bennett, Richard's father, was arrested at his country home. Judge Harrison, who had denied Fisher's request to search the warehouse, was also in custody. A scheme that had been in place for years collapsed like a house of cards. James Montgomery was fired from the prison system for having an inappropriate relationship with an inmate, but escaped prosecution. His testimony became an important element in the case against the Bennetts and Wilson. Angela Perez, a cellmate and friend of Maria's, was granted parole as a thank you for her assistance to the investigation. 3 months later, the court handed down the sentence. Richard Bennett received a life sentence for first-degree murder, and Lorraine Wilson received 15 years for accessory after the fact and corruption. Marcus Bennett and Judge Harrison also received lengthy sentences for organizing a criminal enterprise and corruption. On the day the verdict was announced, Fisher visited Maria Ramirez's grave. A modest monument in a low-income cemetery was all that remained of a woman who happened to be at the center of a major crime story. The detective placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the grave. "Justice has been served, Maria," he said quietly. "Now you can rest in peace." As he left the cemetery, Fisher thought about how easily the system can destroy an individual, especially if that person has no power or connections. Maria had been victimized not only by a murderer, but by a corrupt system that first used her and then got rid of her when she became a threat. Magnolia Bay was temporarily closed for a complete audit and reorganization. The new administration promised reforms and inmate safety. But Fisher knew that fighting systemic corruption is a marathon, not a sprint, and that for every scheme uncovered, there are a dozen others continuing to operate in the shadows. James Montgomery found work as a security guard for a private company in another state. He wrote to Fisher occasionally, telling him about his new life and how he was trying to forget the tragedy that took the life of the woman he had fallen in love with under the most inopportune circumstances. Angela Perez founded a small support group for ex-convicts after her release, helping them adjust to life on the outside. She often spoke of Maria as a woman who, even after her death, was able to make a difference in the system. Fisher himself was promoted to head a new law enforcement corruption unit. The Maria Ramirez case taught him to never take the obvious for granted and to always look for ulterior motives. And in the archives of the New Orleans Police Department, there's a new folder labeled Case Hash 438, Maria Ramirez. Inside are photographs, reports, interview transcripts, and one small diary in a tattered cover. The story of a woman who wanted to start a new life, but instead unwittingly uncovered a criminal network that entangled an entire city. The story of justice that came too late. In Fisher's office, a new photograph appeared on the wall, a snapshot of a smiling Latina woman taken a few months before her arrest. A happy, hopeful Maria Ramirez, unaware of the role she would play in New Orleans history. Sometimes, sitting up late on a difficult case, the detective would look up to that photograph, as if asking advice from the woman whose death had changed so many lives,